you. Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, Hope. And as we continue to celebrate International Women's Week, every week is International Women's Week, but okay. So it's wonderful to have you here. Again, the Faculty of Agriculture, as we begin to get our fingers into sustainability and landscape, I think it's wonderful that we have someone like Hope who's able to bring an interdisciplinary perspective, a multifaceted perspective to the landscape. And she is a landscape architect. So I briefly want to take this opportunity to talk about important things happening in landscape architecture in Nova Scotia and the university. So the first of all thing is that in 2023, we expect Dalhousie to be a fully accredited landscape architecture BLA program, the only one in the Atlantic provinces and Maritimes, I believe. So that is a big thing for this province and the people that live and work in this province. And then we also have the Atlantic Province's first Green Infrastructure Conference, also in 2023. And that is highlighted by the return of the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects. That's our big kind of central national thing for landscape architects coming to Halifax. So it will be a very, 2023 will be a big deal for Nova Scotia and landscape architecture. And Hope Parnham has been very lucky that she is the current president of the national CSLA, Canadian Society of Landscape Architects. So it's really wonderful that she took up that reign and give a voice to kind of what we're doing here and what we're thinking here. So I will briefly read from this prepared card. It's very long for Hope, but bear with me. Hope Parnham is a landscape architect and planner in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. She is the Senior Adaptation Policy Advisor with the PEI Government in the Department of Energy and Climate Action. She has been working in the field of climate change adaptation, promoting coastal risk awareness and sustainable adaptation solutions for coastal development for more than a decade. And as I said, Hope is the president of the Canadian Society for Landscape Architects, CSLA, and a member of CSLA's Committee on Climate Adaptation. So for Hope, issues relating to climate change and coastal resilience are near and dear to your heart, I understand, and you grew up on the lovely beaches of PEI, which we all know are the best in Canada. And she supports proactive coastal development strategies, nature-based solutions, as well as safe and accessibility to our coasts. So I'll leave it to that if you want to add any more to that, Hope.
That was a mouthful, but thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to be here today. I see some people are still dropping in, but I'm going to dive in so that we have time for a discussion at the end. My name is Hope Parnham, and I'm joining from Charlottetown. I'm here on the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq First Nations. And I recognize the importance of the land acknowledgement, not only just as a form of reconciliation, but also because I think there is so much that can be learned from our First Nation communities with regards to nature-based solutions. And I'll mention that further as I get into my presentation. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. I'm going to share my screen and then I'm going to turn off my video because I think I'll be distracted a little bit. This is actually my first webinar after a year of working from home and doing lots of Zooms. I love having the opportunity to do presentations, so I figured this was a great opportunity to test it with a very safe and comfortable audience. I'm so supportive of the school in Truro and look forward to an opportunity to come speak with you in person the next chance that we get. So just let me share my screen here. And
yeah, it looks good.
That looks good?
Yep.
Oh, good. Okay. So as was mentioned in my introduction, I wear a lot of different hats these days. So I am a consultant. I do planning, landscape architecture, and research consultant. I have worked with the university here, with the local governments, as well as local municipalities on a number of projects. But my main passion and kind of what I have found as a career path is with regards to coastal development and climate impacts and adaptation. So over the past 10, 12 years that I've been back in PEI, my work has progressively focused on those types of issues. I've taken the position with the provincial government just in the past year as the Adaptation Policy Advisor. As at the same time, I've been president of the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects, and we've been working quite a while. I guess it's been about 5 years now since we formed our Committee on Climate Adaptation, and have been working towards promoting an advocacy of the landscape architecture profession as the profession that is ideally suited to address the needs of where our designed and built world and environments and landscapes overlap with those of the natural world. And landscape architecture is a very broad and versatile profession. And I certainly, I joke that I practice on the fringe of the profession, but I think it also just shows what is possible as a landscape architect. So, oh, is it gonna switch my slides? There we go. I promise this is the longest text slide to show you today. The rest will be pictures. In my discussion today, I wanted to talk about vulnerability and resilience, but I first want to talk about what the term vulnerability actually means, because we use the term quite loosely with regards to the coast when we talk about the coast being vulnerable to climate change impacts. And what the term actually means is the degree to which the system, and in this case the coast, is susceptible to and unable to cope with adverse effects of climate change, including variability and extremes. And there's 3 factors that determine vulnerability in a system: its exposure, its sensitivity, and its adaptive capacity. So in this case, we can think of exposure as the degree or the strength of the storm that might hit our coastline. The sensitivity being how much are we actually going to be damaged by that storm based on how strong it is. And then our adaptive capacity is certainly on the degree that we can prepare for that, and so that we reduce our sensitivity or decrease our exposure. So what makes the coast vulnerable to climate change? I think storm surge events and sea level rise are the first that always come to mind when we talk about coastlines and the dynamic nature of the coastline. Storm surge events occur during hurricane type events, post-tropical events, but also just in traditional, like what we see, or traditional, but more commonly, low pressure systems. We actually get a surge of higher water levels during high tides that can cause floodings as well. As a result of climate change, we're going to have sea level rise. It has been rising over the past 100 years. In the Atlantic provinces, we've seen a rise of about 30 centimeters. And the projection is anywhere from 1 meter to 1.5 meters, depending on our ability to respond to climate change going forward. So if we are being optimistic and that we will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and kind of solve the challenge of climate change, then sea level rise will continue to rise for the next 60 years at least, just based on the current emissions and carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. But we are hopeful that the 1.5 meters is an extreme scenario. On our coastlines, we see our infrastructure vulnerable to sea level rise because it was designed at a previous height, a design elevation that didn't account for climate change. We know better now, and we know that we can account for future projections in the design of infrastructure. And the best strategy for addressing that risk is that through the regular maintenance and repair and replacement of infrastructure over time, we can account for those projections. Our coast is vulnerable also due to erosion. So erosion isn't necessarily a permanent thing. When you think of beach erosion, the sand shifts and moves and is lost during events, but then it reaccumulates. But erosion from a land loss perspective at the bluff or cliff edge is a permanent change to the shape of our landscapes. In this picture, you see a well casing of where a cottage once stood on the beach here in PEI. And I do apologize for the bias of my photos are mainly island based. But erosion is a natural process, and it's interesting to read erosion in environmental books in comparison to issues with regards to climate change, because erosion has taken on it's like a bad word. It's a bad impact. But without erosion, we would not have the beaches that we have. We would not have the sand dunes that we have. And erosion is actually what is necessary to protect our coastlines. So where our coast erodes in one location, it accretes in another. And it's very important to consider that as a natural process, just as, you know, watersheds drain water from one location to the other. A littoral cell is what the coastal zone is in terms of the sand movement. So the sand erodes from one location and accumulates in another. And we need that process to balance out our coastal dynamics across the geographic area as well as over time. So I mentioned the dynamic nature of the coast. I'm assuming that we're all very much familiar with our Atlantic provinces coastlines in this group today. But our coast is very dynamic, and that it's something that in design we often take for granted, that this is an environment that does not look the same from not only from day to day, but within the same time of day. On PEI's South Shore, we have a much higher tidal range than we do on the North Shore. Certainly not as high as you have in the Bay of Fundy, but it does change the atmosphere of the space and the landscape that you're working within when you have wide variations over the day and due to the tidal influences. But then also seasonally and annually, we see the variations. This example just compares ice coverage in the Strait and the Gulf, and from one year to the next, very different amount of ice coverage. But then you also can imagine the difference from the summer pictures and what that would look like in comparison to these winter pictures. This year is a record low ice coverage. And when we have less ice coverage in the open waters around the island, we get storm effects that are different for precipitation. So we actually get a lot more snow accumulation during a weather event when there's no ice on the water than otherwise. So even though it's been a really mild winter this year, we're actually getting more snow accumulation. It's been quite an interesting phenomenon to follow this year. So that was the annual and seasonal comparison of the dynamic nature. But over a long period of time, the coast does change. And this is just looking at 35 years, but if you can imagine over thousands of years and the changes since the Ice Age, our sea level has risen. Our coastlines have changed dramatically. Maps have been redrawn. And what I have circled here in this photo is the comparison of where the beach it lays in relation to the highway that has not moved. And what you'll notice is that the beach has actually stayed the same. While it has moved closer to the road, the beach width has maintained itself over time and through these variations of tides and seasons and years and sea level rise, because we have had sea level rise over the last 35 years. So when we talk about vulnerability of the coast, I'd like you to consider this simple example. This is up in Kildare Capes in Prince Edward Island's west coast. It's a small provincial park that has a campground and a day park, and previously had cottages. So if you can see my mouse, they're outlining the cottages in 1974 were eventually relocated as the beach migrated landward, and then eventually were removed altogether. They have since lost a number of the campsites that used to be adjacent to the shore. And the concerns when I was brought in on this project was with regards to the vulnerability of the highway. So I point this project out because it's a simple landscape, but it highlights the difference between the vulnerability of a coastline, a natural system, versus the vulnerability of what we have put in the coast's way. So what is vulnerable here is actually the road, campsites, the cottages were vulnerable and were removed. But the beach has actually been incredibly resilient. The beach has sustained itself. The beach has moved. What will cause problems for the beach is when it gets too close to the road. and it has no further way to move. It can't be as dynamic as a system as it requires it to be. And so that is where we get the comparison of the terms vulnerability with resilience. The system, being a coast, ability to prepare for, recover from, and adapt to the effects of climate change, AKA the ability to bounce back, right? So our coastline, our beaches have an incredible ability and incredible resilience to those natural processes that we associate with climate change, like sea level rise and like extreme storm events. It's the infrastructure and properties that are in the natural system that are vulnerable. So I want to talk a bit about adaptation, and for those of you that have seen me do talks on coastal adaptation, these slides might be a little bit familiar because coastal adaptation is not new. We've been talking about protection, accommodation, and retreat for 15, 20 years, at least. That's when these issues first kind of came across my desk as I was studying landscape architecture and looking at flood impacts. So with regards to protection, which is the seawall example, we're tending to think about engineered solutions, and protection tends to be the solution that we immediately think of when we think we need to adapt to climate change in the coastal zone. We want to build a defense to prevent the impacts to our properties or to our infrastructure. This seawall example that's shown in the picture is actually in Kildare Capes along that road now. And as a result of that seawall going in, the beach system has significantly changed. When we accommodate or accommodation, it's the second strategy for adaptation. It means that we've used design solutions to consider our land uses and consider how we develop, but to develop in a way that acknowledges the natural processes that will be unfold as a result of climate change, but also that have happened in the past. If you're building in an area that may be at flood risk, then you have to build differently than when you build somewhere else. And that's what they mean by accommodation. And I think that for most of you on the call here today, that's where we sit as profession that's looking at how we can work within the landscape, whether we're designing and building or whether we're restoring and conserving. We're trying to accommodate human uses and natural processes at the same time. The third option, which used to be referred to as retreat, we're trying to reframe from a marketing campaign perspective, if you will, because retreat means we've lost. If we have to abandon something, but we haven't lost when it comes to natural processes. Nobody's lost. That's just the way it is. That's the laws of nature. What we instead need to think of is that we need to migrate or relocate. And that requires social change. That requires us to accept that nature is going to do what it's meant to do and what it has always done. And that we made a mistake in where we put something in the past, and that we need to reconsider that. The issue with regards to protection and engineered solutions, and I certainly don't use the term engineered with regards to engineering as the profession, because there's a lot of solutions out there that no professional was involved with, but just someone with access to some concrete and a backhoe. But protection solutions or hard armoring solutions are very expensive. They require ongoing maintenance, and there are no guarantees as to how long they will last. So when we talk about protection of the coast, we're actually protecting the land behind the coast and the assets that are behind. You don't see anybody coming in with hard protection resources. This is quite costly type work on a coastline that doesn't have some other kind of investment in it. The other issues with regards to protection is that when you protect the coastline, you impact the adjacent properties. And so the force of a storm wave, for example, needs to go somewhere, and it gets redirected down the armoring and to the adjacent shorelines that are not protected or armored. And you actually get accelerated impacts on those adjacent properties. So we don't only get the impacts to the person that put in the armoring, but we get them to their neighbors as well. In this example, we can see that the armoring that was added the top picture is in 2000 and the bottom picture is in 2010. But armoring was put in to protect a new large home. And as a result, the beach that they built their home on has been lost. Not only does this impact that property owner and their ability to have a beachfront property, because now they have a rockfront property, but this property is located adjacent to a public beach. Just south of the photo is a large public parking lot, and you can see the trail system that comes in from the parking lot into the beach. And where people would normally actually settle is on the north side of what is now armored, so that we would access the path, walk the beach, and actually sit there on your towels and whatnot, set up your umbrella on the north side of this picture. So the public have actually been impacted because of the loss of disconnection. And it's important to remember that from a perspective of who has rights on the beach, anything under low tide, or under high tide, I should say, anything that gets wet is actually federal jurisdiction. And so no private property owner actually has the rights to that land. However, we continue to alter the public realm for the sake of protection of the private property behind it. Further costs of protection include the impacts on wildlife and habitat loss and species at risk. Here in PEI, we have a number of vulnerable species who live within the coastal zone. And again, they're not vulnerable to natural processes, they're vulnerable to humans and the impacts that we have on the coastal zone. In the example of the bank swallows, their nesting grounds are in the vulnerable or erodible cliffs of PEI's shoreline. And if someone was to want to build or develop on a property that has that type of a bluff shoreline, the first thing that they usually do is then armor the shore and cover up the nesting grounds. So they destroy the nest of the vulnerable species, which the habitat is surprisingly not protected under the Species at Risk Act. It's just the birds themselves. So there's sort of a loophole, I guess, that as long as the bird's not in the hole, you can do what you want with the nest. The other aspect of loss of habitat is for the entire ecosystem of coastal habitat, certainly with regards to salt marshes. So where we see seawalls being installed or armoring being installed, the salt marsh is gradually squeezed out. It can no longer migrate landward, like we saw in that earlier example with the beach, migrating landward, but the beach actually staying the same. In this example, the top picture shows the marsh migrating, but the bottom shows how the habitat will eventually be squeezed out and not be able to sustain itself because of that alteration. The cost of protection also include the debris and the mess that it leaves when it's not maintained. We see here in PEI, more frequent than not, the debris of attempts to protect the coastline or protect the properties behind the coastline. And then the issues that present themselves because nobody wants to clean it up. As I mentioned, it being federal jurisdiction below high water mark, this area is not the responsibility of the private property owner necessarily who put that structure in. And especially when properties have changed hands, then the new owners may not be aware that their property was the reason the concrete wall was there in the first place. Now, contrasting picture of a natural coastline, we can see that the benefits of the natural coastline are enhanced public recreation, tourism opportunities, human health, and certainly the coastal biodiversity and habitat that they present. We will never see pictures of armoring in advertisements for tourism PEI. You know, this isn't what makes for a beautiful, healthy coastline. This is the result of people who want to be near the coastline, but don't want to deal with the natural processes of the coast. And then finally, one of the costs of protection that we don't talk about enough is that this type of work actually is a very high emissions activity. And so when we talk about the work that we do as a consequence of climate change, that because of climate change, we need to do something on our coastlines, it's counterproductive to undertake work that then is a high emissions activity, which will increase our impacts of climate change and increase the need for us to do more of this type of work. It's a never-ending cycle that way. I use a non-PEI example as maladaptation, because for those of us who are at least my age and older will remember Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, and almost 2,000 people died in that event. And the maladaptation with regards to New Orleans is simply because the dependence on the structures, the dependence on the seawall and the dikes, leads to a false sense of security, and actually promotes more people to build behind those structures. So this is a structure on a grand scale, but we see it here in Atlantic Canada, that where shorelines are armored, you see much more, expensive year-round homes rather than kind of seasonal cottage type dwellings being built. There is a sense of protection that then leads people to invest in the properties, which then as a cycle, that protection is only limited to the event that hasn't yet happened. And eventually, based on climate change, we will see stronger, more severe events. And just as New Orleans did, there is eventually a tipping point, at which point their efforts to hold back the sea could no longer work, and the city flooded. So what we know to be true, and talking to people about their private properties on the coast, this tends to be a sensitive subject, because nobody has ill intentions towards the environment or their neighboring property. But we can look at it from the perspective of what do we know to be true. Shoreline structures, if designed appropriately, they can be effective. Yes, they can mitigate risks to properties and infrastructures. They do not mitigate risks to the coast, to the natural system. We need to stay out of nature's way if we actually want to mitigate risks to nature. But shoreline structures will also, or can also, alter the regional sediment transport processes. So they alter where our sand can go. If we prevent the erosion from happening, we won't have sand for our beach. It will somewhere within the beach system. It may not be right there at the site, but the sand has to come from somewhere. It impacts the conditions of the adjacent sandy beaches and impacts the coastal erosion rate of the adjacent unprotected coastline, and impacts the coastal species and ecosystem. So all of these possibilities of unintended consequences are when we take an engineered protection type approach, a hard approach to dealing with coastal vulnerability, coastal infrastructure vulnerability. So what can we do? The low carbon resilience approach, which is work that is really coming out of Simon Fraser University and from Canadian Society of Landscape Architects perspective, we have adopted many of their philosophies and approaches, but there are many ways you can name this. I just like the low carbon resilience. I think it speaks to all of the language issues that we were talking about, is what is resilience. But low carbon resilience is the strategic integration of climate change adaptation and mitigation. So not only does it prepare us for the impacts and reduce our vulnerability, but it also helps to mitigate. So it does whatever it can to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions at the same time. The benefits of low carbon resilience are that, we avoid the risks and reduce vulnerability. We reduce that chance of maladaptation with all those unintended consequences that can happen. And it actually is much, much more cost effective in the long run. So mitigation plus adaptation equals low carbon resilience. In the coastal zone, the solutions are not new. These are actually quite common sense. We don't repair the things back to previous condition after a flooding event. So if you flooded once, you will flood again. Rebuild in a different way or in a different location. So we need to relocate whenever necessary. We need to move development back from the edge and up to higher elevations. We need to protect and restore the vegetation in the coastal zone to reduce erosion rates. Here in PEI, we have a 50-foot development buffer on the coastal properties. So everybody has to set back 50 feet. In Nova Scotia, I know you have a Coastal Protection Act. I'm not sure if the regulations are in place for that legislation yet, but the intent is to stop the development within that coastal zone. Unfortunately, we don't have regulations in place to require a restoration or conservation of that area when it's not about new development. It really only applies to new development scenarios. And perhaps most importantly, we need to protect the foreshore, the salt marshes, and the coastal wetlands. These are the landscapes that are nature's flood protection. Nature can protect itself and can provide us with the best protection if we protect these types of environments. We need to give them room to migrate and to decrease our own vulnerability and increase our flood resilience. These are the strategies that most people would refer to as nature-based solutions. So for those of you joining from planning and design professions, you have a very specific responsibility because as a professional landscape architect or other discipline that you might be in, when you work on a specific site, you have a responsibility not only to the site, but to your client. The CSLA has prepared kind of a guidelines document to just remind people how these issues apply to them. So the number one thing is you need to understand the projections. You can no longer just rely on hindsight or on past events for what is the future climate and extreme weathers of the location of your project. You need to consider the possible consequences of future climate and extreme weather on your project and assess the associated risks and opportunities. So if you're developing a project, whether it be a development like a building or infrastructure, or whether it's a natural restoration project, you need to think about what the risks are to that project, to that vegetation, and will it be able to sustain itself going forward. You have a responsibility to educate your clients about the risks associated with the changes to come, and to collaborate with your client and to document the agreements that you've made with your client on these responsibilities. You also have a responsibility to think about your carbon footprint on the project. We can do anything we set our minds to it, but that doesn't mean what we can do is what we should do. If it has a big footprint, it's just contributing to the problem. And you have the possibility of innovating creative solutions. And perhaps what we could all benefit from the most is sharing of successes, as well as the challenges and failures with your colleagues and with your classmates. And that is the extent of my presentation for today. See if I can find my camera to turn it back on.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Hope. Delightful, covering off such rich variety of topics and critical issues.